toca a mí presentar a Ori Heffetz. Ori es actualmente profesor asociado en Economía en la Samuel Curtis Graduate School of Management en Cornell University y es al mismo tiempo profesor en la Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Sus intereses de investigación refieren a aspectos sociales y culturales del comportamiento económico y en el rol de la interacción social en las decisiones individuales, el consumo conspicuo, el estatus social. Y sobre estos temas, a pesar de su juventud, ha escrito numerosos artículos en algunas de las revistas más importantes de la disciplina. Ori se formó en Israel, hizo sus estudios de posgrado en la Universidad de Princeton y, como decía, hace el recorrido entre Cornell y Jerusalén por lo menos 2 veces al año. Su presentación se titula Beyond Consumption, Commodities, Symbols and Well-Being. Y estoy seguro que estamos todos interesados en oír más sobre ese tema. Ori.
Gracias, Andrés y Andrea. Es mi primera vez en Uruguay, que me gusta mucho, pero mi español no es buena, entonces I'm going to switch to English. Okay, so again, thanks for the organizers and thanks for inviting me and thanks for coming. I'll try to talk about all of the things in the title, so about consumption and about commodities and symbols and well-being. The idea of the talk, I'll try to give you a quick summary, is that I think it's been recognized that we can move beyond consumption. So consumption is an important thing, but it's only part of what's important, and that we can probably move beyond consumption to a more general framework of well-being. The fact that it has been recognized is not enough. There is still a question of how to do it. And so I will try to emphasize that part. So yesterday we had a fascinating, to me, inspiring talk by Adela, mentioning a lot of the things that I will talk about today. But Adela is a philosopher, and I'm an economist. So to me the question is, I could have titled the talk Beyond Philosophy. So we agree on the philosophy, but how do we actually implement it? How do we measure things? How do we track them, etc.? So I'll try to talk about that. Okay, we're not going to watch the video, but you can watch it later at home. It's a good example of symbolic consumption, something that I wanted to talk about today. So this is more or less the plan of the talk. I will start by talking about symbolic consumption, which is, again, something that Adela mentioned yesterday. I will quickly define it and give some examples and implications and compare it with functional or instrumental consumption, which is something we're more used to. And then I'll give some specific examples of how we can use more or less standard tools from mainstream economics to try to get at these other aspects of consumption, looking at consumer goods as symbols or as carriers of meaning. So that will be the first part of the talk. And then I will try to make this transition from, for economists, you're probably very familiar with this expression here, U of C. So we usually think about preferences that are defined over a vector of consumer goods, or the utility function that is defined over the vector of consumer goods. And I think when I talk about beyond consumption, we want to make a transition from preferences that are defined over the car that Adela talked about, and the suit, and a glass of wine that we will have soon in the reception, to a vector that is defined over what I'm going to call aspects of life, but different people before me used all kinds of other names. So Maslow called it a vector of needs that we have, and Amartya Sen called it a vector of functionings or capabilities, and Martha Nussbaum made her own list of basic capabilities, and Rawls talked about basic rights. So you can call it whatever you want, but we're talking about preferences now that are defined not over the car and the drink and the food and the clothes, but it's defined over more fundamental aspects of life, such as health and self-fulfillment and social status and connectedness and identity and emotions and all of these things. And then the question is, what can economists say about that? So in this framework, C, the vector of consumer goods, is being demoted from the most important things over which consumer preferences are defined just to an intermediate input into the actual important things. W, this vector, becomes the real thing, the aspects of life. And from this point of view, consumer goods are just one more input, an important input, but just one more input into the really important vector, the vector that we do care about. And so I'll try to present a framework, a little bit of a theory, but mostly how to apply it and how these things can actually be measured and can be tracked in the same way that since before World War II, we have been tracking the consumer good vector, C, in accounts such as the most famous is the GDP, gross domestic product, but similar measures. So that more or less will be the plan of the talk. Okay, so let me start with symbolic consumption. I copied here the definition from the dictionary of a symbol. So it's something that stands for or suggests something else. And they give an example, the lion is a symbol of courage. Now, the lion is a symbol of courage. It could have been something else, right? So in this sense, the symbol is arbitrary. Maybe in some culture it's a lion, in another culture it's, I don't know, the snake. Snake seems to me also courageous. But it's not completely arbitrary in the sense that it's not going to be a rabbit. So there is something there that is arbitrary in the mapping from symbol to the meaning, but it often starts with something that actually has a functionality or that is related. I'll give you another example, a wedding ring. So I wear a wedding ring, not because I have some intrinsic preference for a golden ring that I was born with, but because in the society or in the culture where I live, wearing this thing symbolizes a certain thing, that I'm married, that I'm committed, etc. It's arbitrary. It didn't have to be a ring on this finger, right? It could have been maybe a bracelet, a necklace, a wedding hairpin. It could be different things. A tattoo, maybe a wedding tattoo in some cultures. So it's, in many ways, it's arbitrary that it's this thing. But there is nothing I can do about it. Maybe a cultural coordination could change it to something else. So in the society I live in, there is demand for gold and there is demand for rings. It's not coming from some intrinsic preference. It's coming from the role of a wedding ring as a symbol. And it didn't have to be this way. Okay, so what is a symbolic? So this is a symbol. One example of symbols is language. Of course, language is the manipulation of symbols that are arbitrary. So I can say, I'm speaking English now. There is a collection of sounds, money. What it signifies in Spanish, you would say dinero or plata. So a combination of sounds that is arbitrary in a sense, but it signifies something that by a coordination, we all know what we mean when we use these things, but the association has some arbitrariness to it. So what is symbolic consumption? Symbolic consumption is A, an act of consumption, B, that has the symbolic meaning. So it's carried out because of the association or the meaning, etc., beyond the specific activity. Here are some examples. I started with a wedding ring, but you can think about the cross necklace that signifies some religious beliefs, a tuxedo that signifies some event, important event, or a limousine, a Che Guevara t-shirt that signifies maybe ideological belief or your heroes, or it could be it could be signifying an economic system that you believe in. A glass of champagne again, a birthday cake, a Christmas tree, and all of these things. Of course, again, it came yesterday in the talk, logos and brand identity, right? You wear certain things, you drive a certain car, what does it say about you, etc. These are examples of reproducible commodities. So if I want to drive a certain car, there are a lot of these cars that are produced, and it doesn't matter to me the specific identity of the car. But there are also examples of, on the next slide, of things that are actually assigned to a specific identity. Notice that these things don't necessarily have to be observable. People often think about conspicuous consumption. Conspicuous consumption is part of it, but a lot of it doesn't have to be conspicuous. You don't have to signal it to others. It's for yourself. And actually, on the way here, when we were waiting for the pickup for half an hour, a lot of these issues came up. So we talked about diamonds, right? So people think about diamonds, a big diamond ring, as signaling to others. In fact, the demand for diamonds cannot be explained as coming from the willingness to signal, because you could wear a fake diamond, you could buy an industrial diamond this big for $20, nobody can tell the difference. So it can't be about the signal. If you're still wearing a real diamond, it has to be something for yourself, because you're the only one who can tell. Even experts cannot tell a fake diamond from a real diamond without lab equipment. So it doesn't have to be about a signal, but of course signaling to others is one special case that I'll talk about a lot today. Now there is another class of symbolic goods where they are irreplaceable. It's the actual specific good, and I gave you some examples. So my mother's wedding ring, right, if she passed it on to her daughter, that specific ring has its significance. And in this context, I wanted to show the bit from Pulp Fiction. I don't know how many people watched the movie Pulp Fiction? So not too many, but they have there a story about a watch that the grandfather gave to the father, and he went to war with the watch. It's an important watch. And then in the movie, he risks his life to go and save this watch. He can't lose the watch, this specific watch. And you can think of other examples, right? A gift from a loved one and a trophy that you won, etc. These things that cannot be replaced. Again, it doesn't have to be observable, etc. Okay. So it has some economic implications. The fact that a lot of what we consume has symbolic value. Now, I'm not saying everything has symbolic value, right? So if I drink a glass of water, probably the best explanation of this act of consumption is biological. I need the water to survive. And on the other hand, if I put a yellow ribbon or a pink ribbon or a red ribbon on my chest, probably that's 100% symbolic. There isn't any biological explanation. But most of the consumption is somewhere in between. It's not quite a glass of water, and it's not quite a pure symbol. And I think the symbolic aspect is almost always there to different degrees. So you could say when I eat a slice of bread in the morning, it's just for survival. But I also think that the bread sometimes can remind me of home, remind me of childhood. The smell of bread makes me feel safe. So it also has other meanings. But of course, if I wanted to explain only the consumption of bread, probably I think the best model is a biological one, is not a symbolic one. But of course, a lot of what we spend our money on is not bread, and it has a huge symbolic component. So what are the implications of that? It has different implications. First of all, I mentioned before the arbitrariness. Once commodities become symbols, the demand for specific commodities is not inherent in the commodities, it's probably in what they have become to signify. So the set of products that we consume has some arbitrariness. Again, I'm not saying it's all completely arbitrary. It has some arbitrariness. The fact that driving a very expensive car conveys certain things about the person is not completely arbitrary. It's related to the fact that the car is safe and fast and pretty aesthetic and it has some nice features. It's not everything is arbitrary, but there is some arbitrariness there. And so if you think about green consumption, you could actually switch the associations, right? So I remember when the night of the Oscars in Hollywood, artists used to arrive with big SUVs, and then one year, they all of a sudden arrived in Prius, in hybrid cars. It all of a sudden became culturally fine to actually convey your success and your wealth and your edge, not with a car that looks like a tank, but with a car that actually, so cultural associations just changed overnight, and you could signify famousness, success, whatever, by a much healthier, greener, environmentally friendly product, right? Now, how do you make these switches, right? So again, Adela talked a lot about the advertisers. They know their job much better than us. But one of the implications of this way to view the economy is that producers don't just produce a car, they are in the business of producing the meaning, the cultural association. It's not enough to produce the product, you also have to produce the symbolic framework that will give it a meaning. And if you look at modern advertising, you see a lot of that. The product itself, actually, if you look at advertising from the 50s, you see a list of features of the product, why you should buy it. It's good, it will do this and this for you. Today, that's not the thing. You know, in advertising for a washing machine, it's not about the washing machine. It's about where it's placed in the lifestyle and what kind of person are you to buy the right washing machine. So it has implications for demand, it has implications for supply. The bottom line I emphasized on the slide, of course it has some policy implications. For example, if the government could somehow coordinate this switch from the big SUVs to the hybrid somehow through taxation, for example, and other things, then you could change the content of, for example, GDP. Right? So if we think of consumption as having only instrumental / functional value, and we say the gustibus non est disputandum, so we don't argue about consumer is sovereign, they like these cars, we'll give them these cars, that's one way to look at it. But if you say, no, they like these cars not because they like these cars, but because of the symbol, then we could actually change the association and maybe produce a completely different set of goods. Okay, so that was nice. So far I basically gave you philosophy like yesterday. Now what can we do with it? So in the rest of the talk I'll try to switch gears into economics. And the task which characterizes the last, I don't know, more than 15 years of my research is trying to do the following move. So the ideas we agree on, I hope. Now we need to incorporate this into economic theory. How can we do that? I can tell you after 15 years of thinking hard about it, I still don't know. But I have some special cases where I could do something relatively simple and see how far it gets us. How do I measure how far it has gotten us? By how much better we can explain, for example, consumer patterns that we observe out there with this model where we added something of the symbolic idea to it. So that, I'll give 2 examples of that, of how we can maybe tweak with the mainstream model, with the standard model, add another thing into it, and can we explain better now consumption patterns relative to the model that just said, oh, people just, they like these things, that's why they buy them. So that's what I'm going to do in the next X minutes. I don't want to commit. And then I'll try to generalize the whole thing and approach it from a completely different direction. And again, ask, can we apply the mainstream theory? So I'm not going to make here big revolutions. I'm going to make very small revolutions. I'm going to take the standard model, which is great and has a lot of advantages, but it also has a lot of weaknesses. I'm going to see, can we reinterpret it or maybe change something small in it? Not delete the whole thing and start anew, but change something small in it, give it a new context, a new interpretation, and how far will it get us in terms of measurements and empirical predictions, etc. That's going to be the attempt. Okay. So here are some economic implications of symbolic consumption. There's a model by Doug Bernheim from Stanford of conformity, and there is work on fashion cycles and conspicuous consumption and gifts. And something called diamond goods. These are goods that demand increases for them with the price, because what you're buying is not the quantity, you're buying a price. So think about a bottle of wine. If you go to a certain dinner, you ask yourself, how much should I spend on wine? So you buy it by the price, not necessarily, you don't ask yourself, how much wine do I need? You ask, how much should I spend on it, etc. So I'm going to focus now on 2 examples where I have work on. The first one is going to be conspicuous consumption, and the other one is going to be non-budget constraint effects of prices on demand. Again, these are small special cases, and then later I'll try to generalize. So let's start with conspicuous consumption. What is conspicuous consumption? It's consumption that is meant for showing off. So I'm going to very quickly summarize some of the method and findings from a paper from 2011. This is the paper, so all of the detail is in the paper. But let me start with asking you a question. Here's a car. How much does it cost in US dollars? Any guesses? $100,000, other guesses? $500,000, other guesses? Less than 100,000. Here's another car. Oh, so now we're talking. So how much does this one cost? More than 100,000? 500,000. So these are the prices in US dollars, at least a year ago. They both cost $1.4 million. But it's interesting, right? First of all, I don't know, you didn't guess, but people thought that the second one is more expensive. Now, it's important because the signal, there are people in the know and people not in the know, right? The right people should know, they know. Other people don't know. But my point is that when you buy a commodity, you signal a lot of things. You don't just signal the price. These 2 cars, in terms of price, if all you wanted to do was to signal your income, these 2 cars should convey the same message. But of course, there are other things that you signal with them. And the person who drives the red Ferrari is a different person than the person who drives the more, I don't know what's the word, but discreet maybe. Aston Martin, relatively discreet, let's say. I've seen more discrete cars in my life, but right? But so what? So the work I'm going to talk about now is going to be it's a very poor model in the sense that it's going to throw away all of this dimensionality of the commodity and really just talk about the price. So I'll talk about, again, I'll talk about the money you spend on food, the money you spend on clothes, but of course, I could have showed up with a pink leather suit that costs the same as this suit, and I would be conveying a completely different identity. This model won't have it. In this model, it's really just the expenditures. It's just the money. But it's a start. So, okay, so what do I want to talk about? So remember, what I'm trying to do is to explain consumption patterns for the goods out there with a deeper theory, with a theory where preferences are not for the specific consumption items, preferences are for something deeper, what I call fundamental aspects, but you can call them aspects of human development or capabilities or whatever you want. It's the same, we mean the same thing. Okay, so let me start with angle curves. So these are angle curves that I estimated for 31 consumption categories. This is estimated at newest data. Let me just remind you what you see for those who forgot angle curves from first grade in elementary school. On the x-axis, we see household income. It's too small to see here, but this is $0. This is in the US from 2 years ago, 3 years ago. So $50,000 a year, $100,000 a year. This is household income. And on the y-axis, we see how many dollars, on average, a household that makes this much money spends on each of 31 consumption categories. You can see the categories, but the first one is food for home consumption. And the second one is food at restaurants. And the third one is cigarettes, which is, by the way, the only category in the US where expenditures go down with income in some range. Now, this is with dollars. I could actually show you shares, which is more interesting. So this is the same graph in shares. So again, on the x-axis, annual household income in US dollars in 2013. And now on the y-axis, the share of the budget that was spent on the different commodities. So food is a great example of what we call a necessity. The poor spend 25% of the budget on food. The rich spend only 5% of the budget on food. Food at restaurant is the opposite. The poor spend, I think it's 3%, and then it goes up to about 5% and becomes stable. And you can look at different goods, right? So this is hotels, which goes up steeply with income, expenditures on hotel, expenditures on air travel, expenditures on education. And on the other hand, expenditure on telephone bills or utility bills, electricity, water, they go down with income, right? Now, we don't have a theory of these things. Why? There is so much variation out there. Some commodities go up, some commodities go down, some commodities go up and then down. When we teach economics to our students, we just tell them, if it goes up, we say that the income elasticity is greater than 1, and we call it a luxury good. And if it goes down, the income elasticity is less than 1, and we call it a necessity. And then we turn the page and continue. We never say, we don't have a theory of why this is a necessity, this is a luxury. We just blame preferences. It so happens that, that's consumption patterns. We don't argue about it. It's in the utility function. Now, I want to propose, maybe there is a better model. We could say, no, it's not in the utility function. The utility for all of these things is the same. Think about a Cobb-Douglas utility function. So for those, again, who forgot, angle curves in a Cobb-Douglas utility function are just flat. So you spend the same share on each good, no matter how much money you make. on this graph, it will just look like flat lines at different shares of the budget, but they're not going to change. So let's say this is a good model to start with, because we're not blaming anything on tastes. We're saying, I'm indifferent between the things, but I still need to create the variation across the things. So the idea I had in this paper was to, so this is my Cobb-Douglas function there with angle curves that are the same here, the same share I'm spending on each of two goods. Let's say I only have two goods to simplify things, so V and W, and I have a budget constraint. And I need at each income to decide how much to spend on V and how much on W. So think about V as the car and W as food. Now let's assume that V is visible and W is not. So people see how much I spend on car, but they don't see how much I spend on food. What will this give us? So far, nothing. But let's also assume that my utility function is not just the good old some function of VF and W. Let's say it's a weighted average of my utility function and what others think my utility function is. So now I'm bringing social status into the story. So again, it's not a big revolution. I took the standard model. The standard model says you have some utility function. It's defined over the two commodities, V and W. I'm saying, yes, you have that. But you also have what others think about your utility. So it's not enough to be doing well. You also want others to know that you're doing well. Right? That's why you're posting all of those pictures on Instagram and stuff immediately to make sure everybody knows that you're having fun. Otherwise, it's not fun. So an A is the weight you put on others' opinions. So of course, A is a parameter. We can try to estimate it. If it's 0, we're back to the standard model. Okay, so far so good. So what do we have here? Now we have a utility function where I care, of course, about my consumption of the two goods, but I also care about what others think I consumed. But others don't see my income, and they don't see my expenditures on W, the non-visible good. They do see my expenditures on the visible good. So now when I decide how much to spend on the car and how much to spend on the food, I also take into account that if I spend more on the car, more than I would like to if I were on a deserted island just myself, I will distort my consumption bundle toward the visible good, but others will see it, they will think that my income is higher, etc. So you could work it out in a Spence-like signaling game, and you get a separating equilibrium. It's all in the paper, but what comes out of this model is that the visible good becomes a luxury. It actually has elasticity above 1, and the non-visible has elasticity below 1. So what did I just tell you? I told you a story about how you can take the standard model, instead of assuming that we just have intrinsic preferences over consumer goods, assume that we also care about some aspects of life, let's say a functioning that I call social status, but it doesn't have to be social status. It could be a perception of society of my success or whatever you want to call it. And what does it give us? So the question is, what does this complication of the model give us in terms of predictive power? So remember with what I started. I started with all of those, where was it? All of this variation out there, I'm trying to explain it. Right now, we don't have a theory to explain it. Maybe my story will help explain it. So my story gives you an example of why more visible things should be more luxurious, right? Upward sloping, which I should do it like this. And then the less visible things should be more lower elasticities. So we could now take this prediction to the data and try to measure it. For that, we need two things. We need to measure the visibility of the different consumer goods, and we need to measure their elasticities. Now, measuring elasticities is easy. I already have the angle curves. I just need to measure the average elasticity, let's say, or each quintile, its elasticity or something like that. For visibility, I ran a survey, a visibility survey. So here are the different consumption categories: food and home, food outside, tobacco products, alcoholic beverages, clothes, underwear, right? These are clothes, but they are non-visible, or non-visible in some contexts. jewelry and watches, etc. I have these 31 consumption categories. I estimate elasticities. I estimate visibility. I'll show you soon how. And then I can put on the x-axis here the visibility of different things. I only have 31 consumption categories, so only 31 points on this graph. And the size of the circle, the area, is proportional to the average share of the budget you put in it. So this one is home, is housing. The average family in the US spends a third of its budget on housing. That's the biggest one. This is food for home consumption. This is something like 9% of the budget. This is cars. It's another, I forget now, 8%, let's say. Cigarettes, by the way. And so I have here the visibility. You see what's visible. Cars, furniture, clothes, smoking, jewelry, and watches. And you see what's not visible. Life insurance, health insurance, car insurance. And here I have the average visibility. And you see there is a correlation. It's not strong. The R square, if you run a regression, is 0.18. So 18% of all of this variation that I saw there, I can explain with this visibility measure. If I break it into quintiles, so this is everybody. This is the graph I just showed you. But this is the first quintile. So the bottom 20% of the population in terms of income, there is actually no correlation there at all. Second quintile, third quintile, fourth and fifth quintiles actually have the strongest correlation. Here I can explain something like 30–40% of the variation for these people. So maybe these people, there is more symbolic consumption in what they do, the top 40% of the income distribution. And the people at the bottom, maybe it's more like me drinking the water and buying some food, etc. It's consistent with that story, right? I'm not saying it proves the story, I'm just saying it's consistent with the story. It's also consistent with the alternative story. So how did I measure visibility? Let me skip some of it. But the idea is to ask people in a telephone survey a simple question. Well, could be simpler, but relatively simple question. Imagine that you meet a new person. You don't know much about them. They like to and do spend more than average on, let's say, jewelry and clothes and jewelry and watches. The question is, how quick would you notice this about them, and if so, how quickly? That's the survey. Now, I asked the same question 31 times, and I replaced jewelry and watches with food and car and insurance in random order. And then I can develop the visibility survey, which was on the x-axis of what I showed you before. So this question actually gives me a lot of predictive power for explaining all this variation in angle curve, which previously we couldn't explain. That's more or less the paper. So this I did in 2004. 2 years ago, it was 10 years later, I thought I'll run another visibility survey. 10 years passed, maybe the visibility of things changed, etc. These are cultural processes that change very slowly. So I ran 2 years ago another survey. Let me show you. This is on the x-axis is the visibility of the 31 categories in 2004. And on the y-axis is the visibility in 2014. And the correlation is something like 0.99. So it's really a stable measure. Whatever it measures is a pretty stable thing. Different 500 people, 10 years later, you get more or less the same. There is some action, there's some things moved around. I don't want to talk about it now, but there are some interesting things. I also thought, okay, in 10 years I'll want to run it again. By then, nobody will answer telephone surveys, so I'll do it on the web. So in 2014, I also ran in parallel a web session, and this was the correlation with the web session, so the web survey, sorry. So the web survey is noisier, but you can see, other than that the coefficients are a little bit attenuated, the correlation is still pretty high. Okay, so this is an example of the web survey implementation. It's more or less the same question from the telephone survey, it's only on the web, and you click one of the I would notice it almost immediately, a short while after, etc. It's the same idea. But now on the web, when it's much cheaper, I could also play with what do I mean by visibility. So here, originally I asked people, say you meet someone new, they spend more than average on X, how quickly would you notice it? What about if you meet someone and they spend less than average on X, how quickly would you notice it, right? Because in some things, you spend more than others to be noticed. In other things, you don't want to spend less than others, because then you will look bad. You're not trying to show off, you just don't want to be below. Everybody has a smartphone, you need a smartphone. So I also ran a version of that, where I only changed one word in the survey, right? From more than average to less than average. And then I ran other versions of the survey. What kind of impressions will it make on you if you notice it? Good impressions, bad impressions, etc. And then I can run a regression. The dependent variable is these average elasticities. I have 31 average elasticities. The independent variable is the visibility, upward visibility, downward visibility, good impressions, bad impressions, all of them in the same regression. When I put all 4 measures of visibility, I can explain around 70% of this cross-good variation in angle curves. This is getting to be pretty good. If I look by quintile, again as before, for the highest quintiles, I can explain around 80% of the variation. For the lower quintiles, it's much less. This is the first quintile, second quintile. So there's something going on in the top quintiles. By the way, this is on the x-axis, the predicted value from the regression, and on the y-axis, the actual average elasticity, and you can see these things line up really nicely. Okay, so what have we done? Again, I try to explain some variation in consumer demand that we see out there in the world that previously, with a standard model, we couldn't explain. We just said preferences, consumer sovereignty. They like car, they don't like insurance, or the poor like food and not insurance, the rich like insurance and not poor. But I said, okay, can we do better? And the answer is yes. We could measure aspects of each of these commodities that come from a deeper story, a story about signaling or status or something like that. I'm just measuring their visibility. And with this measurable property of the commodities, I can go back and actually explain of what previously we assigned to taste. And I'm saying it's not taste, it's actually coming from something that we can measure. Again, this is the switch from thinking that preferences are defined over a vector C of commodities, of market goods, to telling a different story. Preferences or utilities defined over this vector W of aspects of life or capabilities or whatever it is, and I'm trying to map the relationship from these intermediate goods, market goods out there or commodities, into the deep goods, emotions and success and love and all of these things. Okay, so let me skip a lot of that. I replicated the same idea with clothes, so I took this one category. I have here one category of clothes. It's here. Where is clothes? Clothes are here somewhere. These are clothes, by the way. So it's 3% of expenditures are clothes. But I can break it down to different subcategories. Clothing accessories like belts and sunglasses, suits, boys' clothes, girls' clothes, infants' clothes, underwear, nightwear. They have different visibility, right? Socks. And do the same thing as before. Run a visibility survey, try to put them on different parts of the spectrum within clothes that are pretty visible, but some are more than others. And then look at the different angle curves. These are different angle curves. For example, this is the angle curve for accessories, right? So it goes up and then it's pretty flat. And this is the angle curve for women's shoes. It's pretty flat. Right? So women spend the same fraction of income on shoes, no matter how much money it never goes down, right? It goes 1% of income, 1% more on shoes. In the US, I don't know here. Same. Okay, and then I can do the same thing as before, right? So here is the visibility. Underwear is the least visible. socks, nightwear, versus suits, accessories, women's clothes, outerwear like jackets, etc. Also, they are on average more elastic. And this is especially strong for the higher quintiles, if you look at the R squares. Now I'm trying to replicate this in another country, and I heard last night that there is an effort to do something like that here in Uruguay, so in a few months we will know also, right, if these things replicate in other countries. But this is one idea. So this is one special case of an attempt to go beyond consumption, but very disciplined. So I want to be clear about what's the model, look at the implication, go back to the data. It can be done. But remember, I threw a lot of the story out. Because when we decide on a car and on a suit, we don't just look at the price and the expenditure, we look at a lot of other things. So can we bring them too into the story? I'll get back to this question later. By the way, okay. So here is another example. This time it's from the non-budget constraint effect of prices on demand. What do I mean by non-budget constraint effects? For those who remember, introduction to microeconomics, we teach our students that preferences are defined over the commodities, but then we have a budget constraint, and so we have to take account of prices because, expensive commodities we can't afford a lot of. We have to somehow fit it within the budget constraint. In that theory, preferences and prices are two different exogenous things, right? Prices show up. Commodities show up with prices, and they show up with certain preferences, and then we find equilibrium or demand patterns. But if you think about symbolic consumption, you realize that commodities and prices are not separate. And I can go back to the example from before. If the price of these cars changes, their meaning will change. Their what they convey will change. It's not like if the Aston Martin 177 starts selling for the price of a Fiat, all of a sudden everybody will want it. Initially, probably, yes, everybody will buy it. Eventually, probably the people who today buy it will switch to something else, or at least some of them. Maybe they'll switch to the Ferrari, right? So price is part of the package. Now preferences are defined over a package of commodity and price. Commodity itself is a bundle of properties. Now before I had a very simple model. What is the bundle of properties? I just said that the properties are the visibility and maybe the quality of impression. That's what I call a commodity. Now I'm saying also price. The price itself is part of the commodity. Commodity A with price of $10 and commodity identical at the price of $100, two different things with two different preferences over there. Okay, so what can you do with that? So we have a paper, I'm not going to say much about it, but you know now how to find it and what it's called, where we try to actually estimate what will happen if we change the sticker price of something up and down to demand. Now, it's very difficult to measure usually. Why? Because when you change the sticker price of something, it also means that it actually becomes more or less expensive. So when you try to estimate the effect of changing the price of something on demand, what you get is both the budget constraint effect and the non-budget constraint effect. But if you could somehow disentangle the two, so change the list price of something without changing the price that a certain consumer actually pays, you could disentangle the two. You could say, how does price affect you as it enters the budget constraint, separately from how does price affect you through these other, you can call them symbolic or other effects. Let me give you one example that we did in the paper. We went to a restaurant where they have a fixed pre-menu. So you can choose one entree of 5. You'll pay the same for the meal. But these 5 different entrees, if you buy a la carte, they have different prices. So every week we changed the a la carte price, and we looked at how it affected the demand of those who order from the fixed spree. So it's not entering their budget constraint, but it could affect them through saying something about the meal, about the food, etc. So we did this kind of stuff. We did it in the lab. We did it in the field, not with cars. We did it with candy and food. But these are things that can be done, and you could try to estimate these things. Okay, so these were all very special cases, right? Because I started by telling you a big story about symbolic consumption and say, look, it's not the consumer goods and the preferences over them. It's really something more fundamental, aspects of life or aspects of human development. Let's define utility, the utility function over them. And let's do economics, perfectly standard economics, just with a different vector. Instead of consumption vector, with this vector of emotions, and it's not just emotions, it's the amount of equality in society, it enters my preferences, right? And the amount of justice and lack of corruption and my sense of security, job security, all of these things enter my preferences. We can do economics with that. Now, how do we do economics with that? We need 2 things. We need to measure the quantities of these things that I consume, just like I just showed you how the government can measure the quantity of consumer goods that each household consumes. And we need some measure of the prices. Now, these are not market goods, so we don't have market prices. We need shadow prices. So I'll give you some idea of how to do that. Okay, so I'm going to embed this in a more general framework of a search for measures of well-being that are alternative to consumption-based. And the best place to start is a graph that I am borrowing from a great book that I highly recommend. It's called Beyond GDP. It came out a few years ago by Marc Florbe and Didier Blanchet. And this book, this is on page 3 of the book, they try to summarize, I don't know if you probably can't see, but these are the years. This is 1960, 1970, all the way to 2010. And these are a lot of approaches, different approaches to come up with an alternative measure to GDP. And you can see that as soon as GDP started becoming a mainstream thing around the 60s, already started different movements of trying to find an alternative. Now, what is GDP? GDP is a consumption-based indicator, right? It's more or less those household expenditures that I showed you before. It's not exactly true. There is also investment in it, and government expenditures, and exports. But a big chunk of GDP is just these household expenditures that I showed before. Sum them all up, and you get GDP, or a big component of GDP. Now, what could be alternatives to that? So there were all kinds of ideas. For example, Easterlin thought just ask people about their happiness, and this will give you a good measure of well-being. There were other approaches of, let's take GDP. It's not such a bad thing. It's just missing a lot of important things. Let's do some kind of augmented GDP, add to it what it's missing, air pollution, violence, crime, and try to fix it. So there were movements that tried to do that. One of these things, by the way, here is the HDI that everybody here knows, the Human Development Index. That was an idea, one way to implement SENS capabilities approach and come up with an index. And this index has been very successful. I don't know if many of you know, SEN didn't want to do that. He thought it would be a vulgar way. The HDI, you just take 3 things, right, and you throw them into an index, and you call it a capability, inspired by capabilities approach. He didn't want to have anything to do with it. Then he saw later that it had some traction, that it got media attention, and that it got people talking about a broader agenda. It brought a broader agenda to the table. He joined, he became on board. But think about what's the HDI. The HDI replaces one arbitrary thing, consumption, with another arbitrary thing, life expectancy, education, and consumption/income, right? Gives them equal weights. Why equal weights? We don't know. We don't have a theory for why, but we're not sure what's more important, so let's just be fair and give them 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. Now, you know, it's a great start, but can we do better? That's the question. So, for example, can we make the HDI more complete by having the whole vector W, everything that is important? It's not just life expectancy, education, and income. Now, of course, there were measurement constraints, right? So the HDI, one of the factors of its success was that the data already existed. So for many countries, we already have this data. Let's just aggregate them. So this is, of course, an admirable effort, and it had great impact on the discourse, right, on the conversation. But can we do better? Can we list the whole vector of things that are important in life? Just like today, we're measuring all of the components of consumption, or, you know, the ones that we can, and then try to find something about preferences, the utility function over these things, and then create a vector where the weights actually come from the utility function, right? So I have a marginal rate of substitution where I'm willing to exchange more life expectancy, you know, how many years of life expectancy with how many years more of education. I probably have some marginal rate of substitution. Can we actually measure that and then put that as the weight in the index? And of course, the weights are not stable because utility is not linear. So at different levels of consumption, the weight is different, etc. Can we do something about that? That's more or less the idea. This is another example to determine a list. What will go into the vector W of aspects of life? So I'm sure everybody's familiar in this room with the Stiglitz-Fitoussi Commission. One of the conclusions was well-being is multidimensional. So we have the vector. What are the dimensions? They list 8. First and foremost, notice, material living standards, income, consumption, and wealth. So first of all, that's an important input. But beyond consumption, there is also health, education, personal activities, including work, political voice and governance, social connections and relationships, environment, insecurity, both economic and physical. So here's a list of 8 factors. That's another list, right? And I could go on and on. There's a lot of lists like that were proposed by different people, and Martha Nussbaum have a list of 10, etc. Okay. So what we tried to do in the past few years, and the first paper in the series was published 2 years ago. I'll refer to it as BHKS, just for the last names, Benjamin, Heffetz, Kimball, and Sembrot. What we tried to do was to move beyond these ideas that different researchers come up with some measure that they say, let's replace GDP with that. And specifically in the title of the paper, we think about happiness-based or life satisfaction-based measures where they say, let's replace GDP with a question about happiness. And we say, let's just construct a full index with everything that's important. Of course, happiness is important, but consumption is also important, and health is also important. And happiness does not capture all of them, or at least not the happiness questions that we see in surveys that governments run these days. So here's the idea of the paper. Let's think, again, just of consumer price theory, right? Let's take utility that is defined over a vector of aspects. That will be our theoretical framework. It's pretty standard. We only changed C here to W. That's all we did. That's easy enough. But now, let's try to identify what goes into W. What are these more fundamental aspects in consumption? Our idea was we're not going to invent our own list. We're going to take all of the lists that we can find in the literature, starting with Abraham Maslow, 1946 Pyramid of Needs, all the way including Sen and Nussbaum and the Stiglitz Commission. We ended up with a list of 100 and something things. Let's throw them all in. And now, how can we construct a GDP-like measure? We need to measure for an individual their levels of consumption of each of these 100 things. And we need to elicit from them the marginal rates of substitutions. How many of this are you willing to replace for that, for how much of that, and based on that we can get the weights. This was the idea. So how did we do it? Let me skip that because it's also in the paper, but I said all of that in so many words. Okay. So first of all, we need a vector of aspects of well-being. As I said, we have no idea what goes in, but we just looked at a lot of lists and took all of them together. In the paper, we have more than 100 aspects. Since then, in the last 3 years, we actually, the list it keeps getting longer and longer. Now we have 2,000 aspects in the list. This is a very long list of things, but of course, you can always find things that you forgot before. One problem with these long lists is that there is a lot of overlap. And this overlap is a huge problem. Think of GDP if you double count things. So you count expenditures on cars, but also expenditures on vehicles, and also expenditures over a bigger category, right? You don't want to double count things. Now, when I talk about aspects that we care about, security and happiness and health, how do you know that you didn't double count, especially when you have such a long list, you have synonymous things? Is anxiety and stress the same thing or two different things? Do they overlap? So that's a huge issue, conceptual issue. We discuss it in the paper, and we are right now developing some methods to identify overlap. I'm going to ignore it in the rest of the talk, but I don't want to hide it. It's a huge issue in this context. It's a huge issue for GDP, for national accounts, for consumption-based. Okay, here's an example from the paper of the list of aspects that we have. So we, for example, have the aspect, your personal growth. This is something that people care about, or your being the person you want to be is something that people care about, or your ability to fulfill your potential. And in parentheses, who proposed it, right? So this was proposed by Kahneman and Deaton, and this was proposed by Maslow, and etc. So somebody else doesn't like our list of aspects. Great, go back to the appendix, construct your own list. We tell you where we took everything, and okay. So we have a list. Now, we have to get the marginal rates of substitution. How do we do that? In the paper in 2014, we had this web survey that looks pretty ugly, but it worked. I'm going to skip it and immediately show you a better survey that we are nowadays working with. This was also, you have to add to the Benjamin Heffetz, Kimball, Zimbrodt, also Kristen Cooper, who joined us recently. And this is what it looks like now. So what are you seeing now on the slide? Let me explain, because it's too small. This is web respondents. This is what they see on their mobile or on the screen. Consider your life over the past year. On average, how would you rate your health during the last year? And then we explain how to use the scale. But you have here something that goes from 0 to 100. This is your health. The worst you can imagine is 0. The best you can imagine is 100. And you just move the slider. So let's say I'm giving my health 56. That's one aspect, right? We have a long vector. Okay, next screen. Same question about your financial security. Where would you put it? 0 is the worst you can imagine. 100 is the best you can imagine. You move it. How much do you rate yourself over the last year? You give it a number. Now, you could do this, in principle, over 2,000 things. Of course, you will die before you did it. So we have to do some pooling, right? We have to take a chunk of the population, maybe the same age, same sex, same income or something, and we have to assume that they have the same preferences. It's a huge assumption, but... And then we give each one of them a subset of the aspect, a more manageable set. So we're now running these kind of things on thousands of individuals to trying to get. But let's say I only asked you about 10 of these. So you rated 10 of these. Now comes the interesting part. So now I know your vector. Let's say I know how much you are on health, how much you are on financial security, how much you are on other things. How am I going to aggregate it? I need to create an index. I need to multiply it by the weights. Where am I going to get the weights? From the marginal rates of substitution. So now I'm going to ask you a series of questions like this one. What do we see here? In the green, you see how much you rated health before. Let's say it was 56. And in yellow, you see how much you rated your financial security. Let's say you gave it a 64. But now you have to choose between two imaginary worlds. In one of them, financial security stays the way you rated it over the last year, but I'm giving you 4 more points. Imagine that you felt in a way that on health you gave yourself 4 more points. Or this is a different world, option 2. So this is option 1, option 2, and respondents have to click on one or the other. Which one do you prefer? Option 2 is your health doesn't change. It remains as it was in the last year, but I'm giving you 5 more on financial security. Which one do you prefer? And let's say I prefer 5 more on financial security. Fine. So on the next thing, I'm asking you, what about 4 versus 4? So I still prefer this. Okay, what about 4 versus 3? You say, oh, now I switch. Fine, now I have your marginal rate of substitution. It's the same thing that we do in principle. I ask you, do you want 4 apples or 3 oranges? You say 3 oranges. What about 5 apples and 3 oranges? You say, oh, I switch? Okay, now I know your indifference curve. Basically, that's what we're trying to do with these things. Now, of course, it's all hypothetical, it's non-incentivized, it has a long list of problems that come with it. But this is the idea. This is the first step in trying to show that this is actually possible. So in the published paper, we had a list of 100 things, and we used this kind of, much uglier survey that I showed you before to calculate these marginal rates of substitutions, and then we can rank things by the relative marginal utility on average, right? We did a lot of pooling. It's really a terrible first approximation. We assume no heterogeneity of preferences, etc. It's terrible, but it's the best we have so far. And in the paper, this is table number 2 from the paper, we listed by the order of what came up important and what, and you can see here, freedom from corruption and injustice, number 1. Then overall well-being of you and your family, then the happiness of your family, your health, your being a good moral person, right? These are things that don't enter through consumer goods. We never get them when we look at consumption. Of course, the well-being of your family is affected by income, but being a good moral person, the quality of your family relationships, society helping the poor and others who struggle, the morality, ethics, financial security, that's important, that we see through income, freedom of speech, well-being of people in your nation, etc. So here are some of the summaries, some of the things at the top that came in this one survey, and we're now replicating, and we're replicating it in different countries. But this is just one way to demonstrate, and it's far from a perfect way, but one way to demonstrate how we could actually work with a vector of things that are not consumption and get the weights. So family happiness and life satisfaction. Family comes up a lot, actually. The family is important to people, and not surprisingly. Health is important, security is important, but values are also important, right? We never talk about that in economics. We could actually compare some of the objective indicators because we had on our list also some objective things like income or unemployment, and we could compare how well they did relative to the subjective, you can call them, things. And we could also think about people's ethical systems. So for example, we had equality of opportunity. How much would you rate your nation over the past year on equality of opportunity? You can tell me, and then I'll ask you, and how much do you rate it on equality of outcome? So just look at income distribution. And then how are you trading off the two, right? How much are you willing to give up? So to have an income that is less equally distributed, but give more equality of opportunity, or the opposite. And for example, in the US, equality of opportunity came more important on average This ranked number 19 out of 100 and something aspects, and equality of income, only 66. So in the US, people care more about equality of opportunity. They're willing to give up to live in an unequal society as long as they feel that everybody had the same. And you know, you could think of other countries where it's the opposite. They care less about equality of opportunity, but they want a smooth income for others. And of course, we found huge differences between Democrats and Republicans. So it makes us a little more confident, a little more confident. We're still very suspicious about the whole thing. Some days we believe in it more. On most days, we are quite suspicious of this. Could it actually work? Could we develop it into a reliable measure? Could we implement it in different countries, etc.? Give us 70 years from now the status of GDP. Remember, GDP also started as a crazy idea, right? In the 30s, I mean, Keynes thought about it, and then in World War II, the implementation started. People thought that's a crazy idea. You're going to count all the expenditures on clothes and tanks that the economy produces and financial services and add it all into one number. What use are you going to have on that? It's really a crazy idea, but 70 years later now, it's actually, we can see the use. The methods became reliable. We can trust the numbers. Or, you know, for some countries, we can trust the numbers. So this is the idea. Maybe with this crazy thing that shows some promise, we could improve on it in the next few decades and come up with some system of national accounts that are not consumption-based. This was the idea here. In the paper, we break it down by demographics, right? So men and women have different preferences, and low and high income, and religious people versus non-religious, etc. The sky's the limit, right? We can do a lot of things with these things. It's encouraging the things that Sen emphasized or that Rawls emphasized do come up as important to people. So in a way, you can say that we're providing now empirical justification to some of the philosophers that sat across the fire and dreamt up important things. They were pretty smart. They had good intuitions. Now that we measure things, we see that they often had it right. Of course, there is a selection problem here, right? I'm only focusing on the philosophers who got it right and became successful, and we remember them. But okay, so this was one example of how we could generalize, try to generalize the framework. It has a long list of problems, as I said before, and I want to emphasize them. I showed you a way to aggregate across aspects of life or commodity of capabilities for a given individual. There is a whole big question of how to aggregate across people, and this is an active, open question. There are some directions. We have a proposal, and other people work on it, but it's a big, open question that we haven't solved yet. It's not that GDP solved this problem, right? GDP adds a dollar spent by the poor and a dollar spent by the rich add $1 to GDP. So it's not like we have a great solution there, but it's still an open problem. There are other measurement issues, right? Our surveys may not be reliable, may not be stable. They are sensitive. People could move their rating a lot, etc. So it's all work in progress, but we hope it's a useful place to start. Now, what can we do with it? So there are different things we can do with it. One is go back to the HDI, for example, the Human Development Index. It only has 3 things in it. Could we make the list a little longer? We now have other things, other aspects that we have good data for 200 countries. Could we add them to the HDI? What about the weights? Maybe we could run a survey like that and get the weights according to people's preferences, or at least their stated preferences, right? I don't know. We have to think about real preferences, stated preferences, laundered preferences, the meta preferences were mentioned yesterday. So Do I report in the index, in the web survey, what I would like myself to want or what I actually want? So these are big questions, but could we generate an HDI version just with different weights that better reflect the people's preferences? And it may not make a big difference. The ranking of the countries may still remain the same, but maybe not. If we want to go back to GDP, maybe we could just extend GDP. So take GDP as it is, add to it some things that are not currently in GDP, but the problem is we don't know the prices. We could develop shadow prices. So take things that are in GDP and ask people how they will trade them off against air pollution or cohesion in society or whatnot, political voice. And then maybe we can create a shadow price and then just add it to the GDP as we always have. So that's another possible implementation. We didn't do it yet. Hopefully one of you will go and do it in the next few years, etc. Okay, so let me just summarize the entire talk so far and then I'll take questions. Everybody agrees that we need to move beyond consumption or income on GDP. Everybody's in quotes. Why? Not everybody agrees on it, but in this room it's everybody, I hope. Does anyone in this room not agree? Be careful, it's there's social, right? There is social status and it's okay. So we agree that we need to do it. We have no idea how. It's not easy. I showed you some attempts or shared some ideas, some directions. I don't want to play them up too much, but some beginnings of directions of how we could do that, two completely different approaches, right? So the first examples I gave were, let's take one aspect at a time, and see if we could do something with it. Just take the traditional model, we have preferences over consumer items, but also over social status. Just one other thing, but also over the prices, and see where it gets us. And this is something that I think is promising. It improves our ability, for example, to predict angle curves by a lot in some contexts, in some quintiles. So that's one approach. The other approach was, let's try to take a few steps back and look at things from the bird's eye view, right? Let's take the whole vector of things that are important. Let's prepare a long, comprehensive list of functionings and capabilities and basic rights and all of these things, aspects of life, and try to measure how they enter the utility function. In this case, we had to rely not on revealed preferences, but on stated preferences. We asked people in a web survey, who knows what's the relationship between what they told us and real quote-unquote preferences. What are real preferences is another philosophical question. But we could try to study these things. And in fact, we and others, these are active avenues for research. And I try to emphasize, unlike in the inspiring philosophy talk yesterday, I try to emphasize from a point of view of an economist. Let's take the theory. We have a great theory out there. We just need to tweak with it a little bit. And let's emphasize measurement and implication and data that are already out there in the real world. There's a lot of data. We just need to put everything together and make progress. So the bottom line is maybe optimistic. It may be possible, maybe, no big promises, but it's difficult. And so I think we wrote recently in a big, we had a big grant proposal. We are asking for money. And we ended the proposal by saying that we don't know that any of this will be successful in the end. It may be a waste of our years and money and, you know, our brain power and a lot of endeavors. We don't know. But for the chance that it may be successful, we think it's worth the effort. In other words, we think it's worth a serious attempt to try to make it work. And so the last thing I want to say to you who are already, I'm preaching to the choir, right? These are people who are already interested in these things. I think it's worth the resources and the effort and the time of as many economists as possible at this point. Of course, there is some maximum, but we are very far from it, to actually be working on these things and trying to get it right, even though it may, we may look back 10 or 20 years from now and say it was hopeless. That's, yeah, let me end there. All the papers I mentioned are available on my website, and let's switch to the more interesting part, the questions.
Thank you. Vamos a tomar 2 o 3 preguntas, si las hay desde el público.
Muchas gracias, Ori. Muy interesante y, como se diría en inglés, disturbing. Así es que hay muchas cosas que pensar y que preguntar y aclarar para ver si hemos entendido. 2 cosas generales que me atrevo a preguntar. La primera, sobre la importancia de distintas esferas de la vida en el ranking. Mencionaste familia. ¿Tienes en mente otras esferas de la vida en términos de ciudadanía o para ver si salen? Y si salen además en términos de método, ¿no? Si la elasticidad marginal de sustitución cambia en el tiempo, ¿esto está hecho en el tiempo? No, ¿no? Es una vez.
Sí.
Para ver si el ranking, digamos, cambia mucho.
So, yeah, so the ideal would be to run a panel and to track these things over time. So far, we only have one cross-section, so we have no idea how these things change. Regarding things that are important, so you can see the list, but the table has 100 and something lines, and at the very top, you won't be surprised, right? So I mentioned, I have here some summary of what comes up. We had 2 versions of the survey. This may be something that is worth mentioning. I kind of didn't have time for it. We had a personal choice version and a policy choice version. In the personal choice version, we just try to elicit personal preferences. What is important to you? But in the policy choice version, we try to ask, imagine that these things have to move together for the whole nation. So for example, equality of your nation has to move together to the whole nation. We can't give each citizen what they want here. And we try to elicit preferences over that too. So something like personal preferences and public preferences. And the 2 are not the same, you can imagine. Anyway, yeah, I can say more things about that, but did I miss part of the question? Yeah, so I'll say one last thing. What was interesting is that when we ask people about personal preferences, they emphasize, for example, things like family or health, etc. When we ask about public preferences, you see a little bit tilting. They still emphasize family, etc. They a little bit tilt, I think I have it somewhere here, even summarized. They a little bit tilt towards, where is it? Here. They a little bit tilt towards freedoms. So they become less specific. Maybe they're not willing to guess what others like, and instead they just want to give them more choice. So when I ask you about personal preferences, you may be willing to give more freedoms or ability to make decisions and just go for your own things. But when I ask you about what would you vote for, you try to a little bit become less specific and just maximize choice in society. So also, when I talk about a comprehensive index and, for example, how would it change over time, it also depends on how exactly you ask the trade-off question, what kind of preferences you elicited. And you can imagine constructing different indices, the personal one, the national one, the regional one, and they may have different weights and may move in different ways.
Thank you. I'll speak in English. One of the critiques of the preference approach coming from a capability perspective was the lack of deliberation, that values are deliberated. And how would you take that into account? And just being reminded about when you were about your surveys and trying to do it for myself. I said, well, would it change if I had a discussion about that? Yeah. If you have focus groups about these questions, do people rate things differently after they have deliberated?
So this is a great question. On your last question, I don't know the answer, but I can guess, and I will put a lot of money on guessing that yes, it will probably change a lot if we even gave them one paragraph before that emphasized one thing or another, or did some kind of a framing. I mean, even if we change the words, I don't know, if we call this instead of your financial security, if we called it your financial stability or lack of financial uncertainty, or so, I'm sure that in itself would also have effect. So I think that's a huge issue. But by all means, Sen emphasized but was pretty vague about a political process, right? How would we determine the list? He didn't come up with a list. He didn't come up with weights. He said there will have to be a political process to determine what society considers important, and I couldn't agree more. This is one implementation, one way to implement a political process, but there are alternative ways, and let's have focus groups and try to give them a version of this in the focus group, right? So, but we want to make things concrete. You know, you often see in surveys things like, what do you consider to be the biggest problem of the nation today? And then they tell you 70% said car accidents and 30% said terrorism, and you know, right? 50% of the nation considered this to be political corruption to be the biggest problem. And I look at these surveys and what can I do with it? Can I now use this to construct a weight on an index of corruption, car accidents, and terrorism? No. What I need is, I want to ask the people, rate corruption in your nation on whatever scale you want to use, right? It's a personal scale. And rate car accidents and rate terrorism. And now tell me, I'm giving you here one more and one less here. How do you trade it? If we ask these surveys in this way, we could then interpret it and say, okay, so here's the index, here are the weights for that person. Now, maybe if car accidents became more terrible and terrorism less, you would change the weights. That's fine. So of course, in different parts of the utility function, you know, we have concavity or convexity, etc. But let's make it deliberate, but mold it in a framework where we could actually use it to construct an index. Now, again, Amartya Sen was a big opponent of indices. I read a quote from the guy who perceived, I forget now his name, I shouldn't forget his name, but who perceived the HDI, and he wrote that he said, yeah, so I think he or someone else wrote, I talked to Amartya on the phone, and he said, Amartya said, what you're going to do is vulgar. And I said, yes, I'm going to do a vulgar thing. Are you going to help me? And so, you know, in a way I can say the same thing. We're doing it in a terrible way, but it's a start.
Yeah, thank you for your talk, and also very interesting. And probably this is a more basic question, but I was wondering, for example, in the first exercise that you did about consumption and trying to estimate the Engels curves, how can you, I guess there is an assumption of homogeneity as well, because I think you treat the visibility of products as if it was the same for a rich than for a poor people. So, and I think that, I don't know, the question probably is if you have tried to distinguish between different quantiles
Yes.
of sectors. And an extra question is, also you were mentioning that you can probably change the scores in HDI when you have these different weights obtained in this way. But my question is, can you compare countries when they have different weights on different domains?
No.
So those two are my questions.
So the first question is an empirical question. The answer is yes. So in the paper I have constructed the visibility index by different chunks of the population, but I don't have a lot of statistical power because I only have 500 observations, and I can split it in half to above median income, below median income. Then I only have 250. There's a lot of noise in the survey. So I have a little bit. There is some movement in the visibility, but not a lot. You can imagine that the car is very visible and clothes are very visible at the top of income and at the bottom income. Of course, which cars, which clothes is different, but cars are visible and insurance is not visible at any income level. But there are some things that move. For example, charity, when you're very wealthy, when you're Bill Gates, everybody knows exactly how much you donated. Maybe when you're very poor also, when they pass the basket on Sunday in the church, maybe people know. So, but I don't have enough data to say more than that, and I think it would be fascinating to look at that. So that's one simplifying assumption I made. I just aggregated. Or assume the way heterogeneity. It's the first thing we do in economics. We assume the way heterogeneity to be able to work with something. But now I forgot the second question. But right. Oh, so this is a big problem in microeconomics, which is when you take into account heterogeneity of preferences. How do you compare welfare of two people, right? And there is the famous, I don't have a blackboard here, but there is a famous, think of the two goods world, right? This is the consumption of good A, this is the consumption of good B. If you consume this amount of A and B, and I consume this amount, so more on both, we would say I'm doing better than you, no matter what preferences are. There is vector dominance. But if we are here and here, so you consume more of A, I consume more of B, who is better depends on preferences. Now it could be that you think you're better, because your indifference curve is like this, and I think I'm better, because my indifference curve is like this. How do you compare? Now, there's a big literature on how to compare in these cases, and there are all kinds of things. You could pick a reference array and then look at equivalence scales. I mean, but these are theories with normative content and some controversy. But that's a huge problem, not unique to us. So look at the consumption vector. Look at GDP. GDP puts the market prices as weights. The market prices don't reflect my preferences or your preferences. They reflect some aggregate. If you wanted to take personal preferences into account, and also there are strong assumptions there, right, about how we maximize. If you wanted to take, so there is in other words, there is a trade-off between we want to respect personal preferences, we want to respect heterogeneity, we don't want to be paternalistic. The beauty of this approach is that it's all democratic. It will come. We're not a philosopher telling you what's the list of important things. We're saying let's ask the people. But you cannot compare across people if you respect preferences too much. So, and this is an open question out there. But again, not unique to this approach.
Tomemos una pregunta más.
Dos más.
Primero, muchas gracias por la presentación, fue muy buena. Voy a hablar en castellano para no dar una cuota graciosa al seminario. Tenía dos preguntas. La primera, en la conferencia de ayer Adela mencionó que el consumo de estatus o el consumo motivado por estatus era relevante en un contexto donde existía desigualdad de consumo, porque es eso lo que genera un valor diferencial, esto que tú asocias con lo simbólico. Quería en primer lugar preguntarte sobre esa afirmación, porque entiendo que puede tener implicancias muy importantes para entender la lógica de este tipo de consumo. Y lo segundo, y asociado también con esa pregunta, es si se ha avanzado sobre distintas valoraciones de las personas sobre, digamos, la tolerancia a la desigualdad en la distribución de este tipo de bienes que proveen estatus. Porque podría pasar de que las consecuencias que tiene este tipo de consumo sean buenas a nivel del bienestar agregado, pero también podría tener consecuencias negativas. Es decir, hay literatura que habla de los dos efectos. Y quería saber si te pareció un área interesante para explorar y cómo la veías vos desde el punto de vista teórico.
So, what do you consider a bad and good consequences?
For example, the rat race is an example, or
And a good consequence?
provision of information, for example.
Wow. I'll start with the second question because I already forgot the first. So the second question, but Andres will remind me. The second this is a great question. So first of all, there is a normative question which I asked you in the end. To you, provision of information is good, to me too, but that's a normative statement to say that this is good and that rat race, for example, is bad. I saw a paper that said that rat race is the only reason why we have innovation in the world. Because think about products today like a cell phone, there are network effects. The first adapters are, from a rational point of view, there will never be first adapters to these products. Why are there? Because of status and rat race, right? So you want to be seen with the newest gadget, although in most cases it will just be a flop and you'll trash it after a year or two. But in some cases it catches on. So, you know, there are all kinds of theories of, it could be that the fact that we live in such a great or terrible, depending on your point of view, modern world with all of these amenities could be a result of that. So that's more or less all I want to say about this question, but it's a great question to think about. What was the first question?
El que ayer Adela Cortina, cuando hizo la presentación, planteó que la desigualdad era uno de los fundamentos para que existiera el consumo motivado por el estatus. Y quería saber si el consumo de estatus, motivado por estatus, también tiene sentido en sociedades más igualitarias.
Entonces, ¿qué es la pregunta? So what are you asking?
Bueno, ¿qué tan de acuerdo estás con Adela de que en realidad la motivación del consumo
Uh,
del estatus está motivado por la
I don't know. So it's also a good question. If you read Veblen, Veblen explains the motive for status not at all as a bad thing or a negative thing, and not even related to inequality. For Veblen, it's almost a good mechanism. So it's a story that he says, but we started as hunter-gatherers. We lived in tribes. So who is a useful member of the community? Those who are good hunters or good warriors. They can defend the community, right? They bring the food, they're good hunters, or they defend. So status was given to the fighters or to the hunters because there was a positive externality. They protected the community. Now fast forward to an industrial society that we live in now. In an industrial society, who is a good member of the community? It's no longer the warrior or the hunter. It's the person who produces, whose marginal productivity is highest, right? The person who brings more production, food, shelter, whatever. Now, who is that person? In the US, there is a myth that the person who produces more makes more money, right? There is a myth of, if we teach our students that you earn your marginal productivity. It's a competitive market. So in an industrial society with this myth, how would you signal that you're a useful member of society? By showing off your income, because showing your income means that you are producing a lot for the society. That's Veblen's story. So in Veblen's story, there is nothing negative about it. And in fact, it's a little bit related to what you said before about provision of information. So it's good that there is a way for the productive members of society to show that they are productive. That makes them want to be productive. Now, you could argue about the assumptions. Certainly inherited wealth is not quite a signal of usefulness, and I won't name names, but open the newspaper and it will make you doubt the assumptions. But these are the assumptions. Now, I think that you could think of a social evolutionary process that over the very long run fixes these things. So you read Dostoevsky and Tolstoy and you read, and actually I should, now we're in Latin America, so you read Isabel Allende, right? How did the rich signal their status? It was on wasteful, useless things of status. And, you read Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Look today how the rich signal their income. You get Bill Gates and Warren Buffett. They basically have a fund that I don't know, they're looking for a cure for malaria, and so the inequality didn't change, the signaling didn't change, but what is an appropriate signal to send? I mean, Bill Gates also has 100 and something bedrooms in his house, but and Warren Buffett also flies around in his private jet, but they signal income through something that has a huge positive externality. I mentioned before the hybrid cars, etc., right? So it's still an expensive car, but why is it expensive? Because it's polluting or because it's actually clean? And I think these things are moving by, you could call it a social evolution process, right? Which society will survive better and will be more prosperous? That society where the symbols have a positive rather than a negative externality. And so over hundreds of years, I think maybe we're moving in that direction.
I hope you're right.
We'll know in 200 years.
Yeah, that's right. Well, you might. Thank you very much. Really stimulating. My question and maybe a comment. Are you familiar, well, I'm checking to see if you're familiar with the Canadian Index of Well-Being, which is different, very different from yours. I bring it up because the earlier question about would the list be different if people deliberated on it? What would that be constructed with? Because in the Canadian Index of Well-Being, with its challenges, and it has its limitations and challenges, but it is having policy impact, which is the question I'm going to ask. But in that case, they actually engaged citizens, randomly recruited across the country, to help discuss and select the 8 domains, and then some of the indicators. And since that, there's been some more work. And so it is having some policy impact in the sense that municipalities are using it. The Ontario government is constructing some poverty measures around it. So I guess one was, were you aware of it? But my question is, really intrigued at the end when you were saying, you don't know if this is going to work, but you think it's worth trying because it will, and I'm interested in because why? What practical policy outcomes do you see if you get this right?
Yeah, okay.
Thanks.
So the first question, I think that in the last decade, and of course the Stiglitz and Fitoussi Commission helped a lot, you see more and more governments with initiatives such as Canada. So the New Zealand government is doing something similar, the French government is doing something similar. In France, it was the same thing. So they tried to come up with the measures and go back to the public. And okay, so 2 things to say about that. First of all, there is a great paper. I forget the second author, but the first author is Cohen de Kank in Belgium. And they try to answer your question empirically. Essentially, they take one country, and they take, I think, a list of 10 things, and they look at something like 8 or 9 methods of determining the weights. One of it, I mean, one is just put equal weights and see what happens, but one is through a political process that you mentioned. One is by some simple survey, or, you have 100 ships, how do you divide them? One is our kind of thing. So they really try different ways and to see what they get. Do they get the same thing? One important thing that they look at, which I didn't mention, but I should have. In a way, we already have a democratic process that already divides the budget. Some goes to health and some goes to education. If you're a great believer in democracy, you could say we're already eliciting people's preferences. They vote. And then the government implements. So I see you're not convinced, but this is one of the things they also do. So they also look at just the budget, the national budget of a country as another measure for the weights, right? We could compare what we get in different countries with a budget that, now not the government doesn't spend exactly on all of the aspects. You have some problem of mapping. So there is a literature that tries to do that, in that specific paper that we cite, so I forget now, but we cite it so you could find it. It's actually very interesting. So it's an open question, it's an empirical question. There is work on it. How would the weights look different with different elicitation methods? I again forgot the second question. Oh, policy impact, that's a great, okay, this is a great question because you see a lot of talk about 2 things. We're going to measure, we're going to start measuring happiness, we're going to start measuring these things, and we're going to use it in policy. Now, measurement is no longer just talk. There are efforts, as I said. We recommend this specific survey. We're now working with the government of New Zealand, trying to convince them to implement this method. But other governments prefer focus groups or, other ways. So on the how to measure and track, and over time we will have enough data and we will start tracking. So this is already happening. The question of policy, you see a lot of governments talk about it. They will use it for policy. It's not clear how. So I could ask the same question, though, about, let's say, GDP or inflation or unemployment. These are indicators that are already used for policy, but not in any systematic way. There's no function that anyone tries to maximize. But we know that politicians put a big weight on GDP. They put a huge weight on unemployment. Why? Because when enough people lose their jobs, they lose their jobs. So they put a big weight on that. They put some weight on inflation, at least central banks. Now let's say we also had an index here that was based on where was it here? On happiness and family and health and security, and it became quite accepted. We showed that it's reliable, it's comparable across countries, but only if we use the same weights across countries. How would politicians use it? I don't know. It may become, in the best case scenario, it may become a fetish like GDP, and it will be quarterly published, and then it would make the headlines. I mean, the HDI is getting there, right? The HDI is making the headlines when it's out. It's only annual. Local politicians don't pay a lot of attention to that. They pay more attention to unemployment and GDP, etc. By the way, unemployment is hugely important, I think. So GDP, we can be for, against. Unemployment gets at the very most important things of people. Being unemployed is terrible. But maybe, these things that would be published quarterly, politicians would pay attention to in the way that they pay attention to GDP. So that's one answer. A different answer that would come from political science theory or from economic theory would be, we have models of how governments function, and they try to maximize some objective function. And then the question is, what do you throw in as arguments of this function? And you could throw in these measures. I think that at the bottom line, it's just as simple as that. What doesn't get measured, politicians are not going to pay attention to. And what does get measured, they are going to pay attention to. And I think in the case of GDP, too much attention to, because we started measuring GDP during World War II not as some welfare proxy. We started measuring it because there was an urgent need to gauge the capacity of the economy to produce tanks and airplanes, and we needed to count basically the productive capacity of the economy. This was, I think, an important accelerator of the development of national accounts. Nobody thought, and Keynes, when he talks about these aggregate measures, didn't mention them as a welfare index. But once we started measuring, and it started being published every quarter, and a lot of countries do it, what are you going to do as a human being? Compare. Try to compare countries, try to track it over time. And then it had become de facto with no theoretical justification, or it has some theoretical justification, but it relies on huge assumptions that have been refuted. It became de facto a welfare measure. Why? Because if you're a politician, what are you going to say? Things are good, things are bad, just wave your hand. You have some figures, you're going to use them. So I think that if we could come up with something, and the HDI is a great example, something that is actually measured, that we put a number on, that comes up every time interval, and has been there long enough. And it's very important that the method is transparent, right? So the method is transparent. Nobody thinks that the government is tweaking with it. I think that sooner or later politicians will start paying attention to it.
Bueno, tenemos que cerrar aquí el programa, esta parte del programa, ya que hay otros bienes simbólicos esperándonos y algunos menos simbólicos. Y con esto terminamos la presentación de Ori, creo que merecen un aplauso.